I like it when people have accents because to me what that signals is, you know stuff that I don't. You have a background that's different to mine. That is cool, that's interesting. I want to find out more about you. Good morning everyone and welcome back to the Story Learning podcast. My name is Ollie Richards and this is the podcast where I answer your in-depth language learning questions. Unlike the main channel where we tell crazy stories about amazing people that have done great things with languages, here we go deep. So if you have any questions for me to be answered on the podcast, feel free to leave them in comments. You can email them to us at, it's ollie@storylearning.com, and that will make it through onto my radar. And if it's an interesting question, I'll do my best to answer it. So today we are answering a question from Nico Perez Galli 984, who says, Ollie, I love your channel. Good. Basically, this gets your guarantees I answer your question. If you start off by complimenting the channel, I'm definitely going to answer your question. So there's a little hack there for anyone who wants their questions answered. So Nico says, I'm an English teacher, so I'm pretty close to perfecting my American accent. It could have been British, so, minus 2 points there, but I'll carry on anyway. But I really want to nail it to the point where no one can tell I'm not a native speaker. I know it's mostly about making small adjustments at this stage, but do you have any tips for fine-tuning pronunciation? Thanks for all the great content. You're a legend. Oh, look at all these. Look, he knows exactly how to get his question answered, this Nico guy. So, Nico, you're an English teacher. So obviously there's a great deal of pride at stake here for you. You want to, you've obviously dedicated so much of your life to learning English, and it's a point of pride now that you want to be able to speak as well as a native speaker and to not even be confused for a non-native speaker of English, right? I get that. I know exactly what that feels like. And it is possible to be mistaken for a native speaker. One of the places I remember that happening to me quite a lot was in Brazil back in the day. When I lived in Brazil, I would often have interactions with people and they would be very confused because I looked like a blatantly European person. But they would assume I was from the south of Brazil, where a lot of people do actually look like me. So, but I was pale, long blonde hair, like it was long back then. And I've always had, there's plenty of things I'm not good at with languages, but accent and pronunciation, I've always been quite strong at. And so I would often get mistaken for native speakers in Brazil. But the thing is, it's usually only a temporary thing, because as the famous adage goes in the world of jazz improvisation, the more notes you play, the more evidence there is against you. So the idea being like the more you play, it can't all be genius, right? So you kind of want to err on the side of playing less and really making it good, because that way you're going to stand a chance of getting towards this state of grace in improvisation. And similarly with languages, like however good your accent pronunciation is, the more you speak, the more you're going to just have slight hesitations, little slips here and there, little tiny nuances that people are going to hear and just realize, okay, you don't speak exactly the same way as my childhood friends do. They would make that sound like, and you get found out eventually, right? That's where it ends up. And I've got to tell you, Nico, like the longer I do this for, the more I believe that as long as your pronunciation of the basic sounds of the language is good, not much else matters. I'm at a point in my life where I've lived in so many places, I've met so many people from different countries and all different kinds of accents, languages. When I sort of step back and think to myself, like, who do I care about in this world? Who do I want to spend time with and talk to? As long as they can communicate in the language, I could not care less about their accent and pronunciation, honestly. It's just not something that even registers for me. And I think even like many of my closer friends, they probably have less good accents in whatever language we're speaking, because I don't know, I wonder why that is. And I think perhaps because being a language guy, I'm interested in other cultures, and I'm just naturally drawn to people from different backgrounds, different languages, different countries, because that's what I like. And so for me, I like it when people have accents, because to me what that signals is, you know stuff that I don't. You have a background that's different to mine. That is cool. That's interesting. I want to find out more about you. Often, if I meet someone who is from England like me, speaks like me, has all the, it's so familiar. I'm sure you know what I mean. There's almost a point where, like, if this person speaks exactly like me, there's almost a point where it's like, I already know so much about you just from your accent, just from the way you speak, that it's all so familiar that I'm not particularly intrigued to get to know you even more. And I guess that sounds a little bit weird maybe, but I certainly do feel that. And so what do I take from this? What am I getting at? What I'm getting at is that pronunciation, like your accent, is almost never the big deal that you think it is. Anyway, that's not what you were asking, so I'm going to answer your question. Let's start by just quickly defining the difference between accent and pronunciation, right? Pronunciation is whether you produce the basic sounds of the language correctly, okay? That's easier in languages that are more familiar. The more distant the language gets, if you're learning languages like Mandarin Chinese, for example, there are sounds which are very, very different. You've got to learn to pronounce those. So pronunciation is typically what you learn in the first few weeks of learning a new language. Can you pronounce the basic sounds of the language correctly? There is a right and a wrong here. It's fairly black and white. Accent, though, is different. Take English, right? So Nico, you're talking about learning English. Great. But what English? If you're in the US, someone from Texas doesn't speak the same way as someone from New York. Someone from Washington State doesn't speak the same way as someone from Alabama, right? So let's imagine that you do learn to speak like a Texan, which would be very cool, by the way. I'd like to see that. Now you go to New York, and then someone looks at you and they think, hang on, you're obviously not from here because you speak with a Texas accent. And so you are already being othered by the people you meet because you have a certain accent. Earlier on this year, I was in Nashville, Tennessee, which I absolutely loved. But they've got a strong accent down there. And I was so aware, I was so conscious as I was walking around the place that I just opened my mouth and immediately these guys are like, where are you from? Right? Because my accent just gives me away straight away. But does it matter? I don't know if it matters or not. But I'm a native English speaker. And even I immediately open my mouth and have that experience of being like labeled directly. It's unavoidable. And the more you travel, the more that this happens. This is partly why I feel that it's potentially a problematic goal, right? Because even if you achieve your aims, well, can you ever really achieve the aims? I'm not sure you can. Now, let's talk about the science behind this. So the generally accepted line here is that there is such a thing called a critical period. Now, the critical period gets disputed, but what the critical period says is that from the age, up to about the age of around 10, when I was first studying linguistics, they said it was like 14, but there's a fantastic paper called Speaking Accent-Free in L2 Beyond the Critical Period. This is from the Journal of Applied Linguistics in October 2020. I'll put a link in the description. And the authors here, they speak to the age of 10 as being the critical period. And the idea here is that up until the age of 10, a child is able to essentially adapt to any foreign language environment that they may find themselves in and develop a native-like accent. After the age of around 10, that becomes a lot more difficult. And so this is why if you know anyone who moved to your country when they were under the age of 10, most likely they speak with a perfect accent now, right? But if you know anyone who moved as an adult, most likely they don't speak with a perfect accent, often with a very strong accent. And it all has to do with this critical period. Now, why does this happen exactly? Well, partly there's a cognitive thing about brain development, right? But also there's an element of your social situation. If you move at the age of, say, 8 to another country, you're going to be going to school, you're going to be in the school system, you're going to have friends, you're just surrounded by the language 24/7. But as an adult, chances are, depending on what you do, you may not even be surrounded by the language at all. You might be working with other immigrants who speak different languages, and so you might have a relatively small amount of exposure to the language in the place that you live. And so these two things combined, the biological element of it plus the reality of where you find yourself in that new environment, means that it can be very, very difficult for someone over the age of around 10, past this critical period to develop a true native-like accent. But there are examples of people who manage to do that. And so if you have what you might call higher cognitive abilities, which is a kind of a diplomatic way of saying if you're really smart, and you can find a way of spending extensive time with native speakers, living in that environment, having friends, then you can get closer. But it is going to be very, very difficult to get to the point where nobody will ever notice that you are not a native speaker. When I look around and I think of English speakers that I know who try to learn foreign languages, accent is one of the things that they struggle with the most. And I think it's a cognitive problem. I think there's an element in which people feel embarrassed to speak in different ways. If you're learning a language like French and you have to start speaking like a French person, it sounds very, very unusual, very uncomfortable to the English ear to be making the sounds of the French language. And so in order to be even ready to speak with a perfect French accent, you have to first be ready in your own mind to the point where you don't feel weird. Step one is don't feel weird about it. Step two, now make the perfect accent. And so for anyone who really wants to develop a perfect accent in a language, the thing that you've really got to do is spend as much time as possible with native speakers. Spend as much time as possible immersed, because only then will your brain get to a point where it realizes, hey, these sounds of the language are normal, and if I don't make the sounds of the language like this, I'm not doing it right. And so you then become motivated because of everything that you're being surrounded by, the people, the friends, the sounds of the language. You want to get to a point where that becomes so normal to you, so natural, that you're now no longer capable of making English sounds when you're speaking, because it's just so blatantly wrong for you. That's the necessary step, and that's what happened to me in Brazil, where I went there and lived there for months on end, and I was completely surrounded by the language because I had friends who were perfectly happy speaking to me in Portuguese, which is very lucky. But if you don't have the luxury of being in that immersion environment, which most people don't, then how can you do this? Well, there is taking the opportunity to take lessons, language exchanges, making friends, being surrounded by the language, using it. But there's also listening a lot, watching movies, things like that. Mimicry can really help here, because mimicry, what it does is it helps you embody the mindset of the native speaker, right? When you move like them, when you act like them, when you carry yourself like them, like your favorite actor in a TV series, for example, that helps you just get into that state where it feels normal. Songs are also really helpful. Learning songs, because when you learn songs, you have to really zero in on the specific pronunciation of specific words. Now, often, you've got to be careful, because often with songs, the pronunciation of specific words in songs is often not the same as regular speech, but it does have the effect of making you listen very, very closely. So I think it's really valuable. In fact, when I first learned Brazilian Portuguese, I was sitting in my bedroom in North London playing the guitar and learning to sing bossa nova songs. That's how I did it, and I think the music probably helped me a great deal there. Also, in order to improve your pronunciation at a high level, you've got to get direct feedback. So like in other areas of language learning, at the advanced levels, hiring a teacher or even an accent coach can be a really good investment, because what they can do is they can just hold up a mirror, and a metaphorical mirror to you, and point out to you exactly what sounds you're making that don't seem completely natural. Right, so there's a real value for instruction there at this point as well. But anyway, I hope that is helpful for you, Nico. For those of you who aren't lucky enough to be in this immersion environment, watching a bunch of movies, mimicking your favorite actors, trying to imagine yourself in this setting is one of the best things you can possibly do. And I've got something useful for you here, which is my best binge-worthy resources for fluency. A bit of a tongue twister, this particular resource, best binge-worthy resources for fluency. And what it is it's a list of TV and movies that we have curated in lots of different languages. I think it's 15 different languages that we've made this in. And it lists all these different TV shows and movies, which are really, really great for language learning, because they're not too weird. They're on kind of regular regular topics that you can use, that you can stand a chance of actually understanding. So anyway, if you'd like a copy of this best binge-worthy resources for fluency, I'll put a link in the description. You can download that's completely free. And that's it for today. I'll see you back in the next episode of the Story Learning Podcast.